Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your patience as well. I know that we are getting started just a few minutes behind schedule. We had a few technical issues with our webinar platform that we are working through right now, but we are getting those sorted. And while we deal with a couple things and wait for our co-host to also join, I would love it if each of you could jump into the chat and let us know where you're coming from. We'd love to get to know you guys. And to introduce myself, I'm Aileen Carroll. I am Sustainability Communications here at Click LCA. I am based in Virginia in the US, so that's where I am. And we're looking forward to a really exciting talk today. I'm sure you guys have all been thinking about LEED v5. They dropped the LEED v5 changes last summer, but there's still a lot to talk about, a lot of people getting prepared for LEED projects in 2026 and what that means. And so real quick, I'll take a look. You guys are great. You're really active here. So we've got some folks from Atlanta, Chicago, Montreal, Nebraska, Toronto, and then we've even got some folks from Mexico City, LA, so Brazil. So welcome to everyone who's joining from all around the world, and east to west, all up and down North and South America. So really excited to have you all here. Now, David, welcome. I know David is working on his audio right now. So in the meantime, I'll get started introducing the topic today. Of course, we're talking about LEED v5, but we're actually going to go a little bit further today. We are going to talk about what happens when you go beyond just the bare bones of LEED v5 compliance, what that looks like, and the benefits that it can bring to your business. And here is the agenda. I will just make this a little bit larger. So what to expect, we are going to be talking about the changes in LEED v5, give you guys an introduction to that. If you can't hear me, well, if you can't hear me, you probably can't hear me saying this, so I'll send a message in the chat. I'm seeing some folks can't hear anything. Often you can check the volume in your browser if that's an issue, just for future reference for anyone who can hear me now. We'll be talking about the intro to the changes in LEED v5, and then we'll be talking about going beyond LEED v5, what that looks like. We'll also be looking at the whole building carbon assessment versus LEED v5 requirements, and we'll be looking at those results. And then we'll be looking at showing value with the P3I platform, which David's going to talk about today. So David, quick question. How's your audio? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I hear you twice. So,
well, we can only hear you once. So if you're okay with an echo, then that's good. So I'm, of course, joined today. You see him there on the screen by Leo Poli, who is an LCA advocate here at Click LCA. He's done a lot of work on this project that we're going to be talking about today, and he's going to be showing you the results, how you can go beyond that minimum LEED v5 compliance. So welcome, Leo. Thank you for joining us. And where are you joining from today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aileen. I'm joining today from Barcelona, Spain. So slightly different location compared to most of the audience, but yeah, excited to get started.
Great. Well, we're really glad to have you here. And if you want to connect with Leo, that is his LinkedIn on the QR code. So you can take a quick screenshot of that and continue the conversation. And then we're also joined by David McLean of P3I.Global. He's going to be talking about that today. You can also see his LinkedIn here. In addition to that, he is also partner at ESG Impacts, and he's a founding board member of USGBC Texas. So a lot of hats that you wear, David. And where are you joining us from today?
I am here in Galveston, Texas.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you guys both so much. And with that, I will stop talking and I'm going to hand it over to David to get us kicked off.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Uh, we're going to start with a definition, the built environment ecosystem. My intent is to make sure that we are speaking to the relevancy of what it is that we're doing from a granularity perspective. And this, hang on a second, this double echo thing is driving me crazy here. So just hang on a second. I got to figure this out. Hmm. All right, I'll try. So you see the definition here of the built environment ecosystem. All man-made structures, features, facilities viewed collectively as the environment in which we live, learn, work, and play. All stakeholders and shareholders therein, that's us, and the natural ecosystems upon which we encroach and alter. So speed happens at the change of trust. When trust increases, new incentives accelerate and costs come down, and complicated processes are simplified, and most importantly, outcomes are predictable. So why is this important to the built environment ecosystem? Well, every new building, community, or initiative out there starts with a journey, and that journey takes money from investors. And investors want their money to go to, very simple, places that are the lowest risk and provide the maximum return on investment. Pretty simple. Well, we've found out that sustainable assets are proving themselves to be the lowest risk and the highest return on investment. So sustainable buildings create greater natural human financial asset value through generational wealth for the asset owner, the asset occupants, and the community in which the assets inhabit. But that money, in its journey to sustainable assets, needs a level of trust that those assets are in fact sustainable. And sustainability has become kind of a catch-all for everything here in the past few years. And these investors with their money are asking for a higher level of trust. That means a higher level of granularity. So that trust is being made up with transparency and accountability, terms that get thrown around. So just for clarifications here, transparency requires disclosure mechanisms. These are standardization of ethical practices that foster trust and reliability of investment grade information and data. And that's important. Investment grade is what these investors make decisions off of. Accountability, on the other hand, it requires enforcement mechanisms. And these are mandatory or voluntary reporting or adherence to specific disclosure mechanisms that independently, and that's important, confirms achievement of specific recognized better standards of care. So if you, from this simple graphic, LFCMC means lowest first cost minimum code. That's the marketplace. That's what's being built out there in 90% of all cases. And it's what we have to push back against if we want to do anything better than that. So the lowest first cost minimum code is the baseline that we will always be compared to on anything that we're doing. So if we put transparency along the x-axis, accountability across the y-axis, anything we do better than lowest first cost minimum code is the value of that initiative. And the market drivers that are wanting to do better than lowest first cost minimum code are things like sustainability, net zero, resiliency, net positive, regenerative, generational, all of these terms get thrown around. They're important. They're a lot of professionals and passion behind them. But at the end of the day, how do we turn all of those terms into trust? Well, a lot of professions have been developed, sustainability consultants, of which we are one, architects, engineers, lawyers, appraisers, code officials, accountants, rating agencies, and green rating systems. All are coming together to form this higher level of trust. We're going to talk about green building rating systems. And we want to put this, what we're talking about today, in perspective with respect to the marketplace. And I'm going to lead into what Leo's going to go with respect to the granularity. But green rating systems all share commonalities. They're all trying to, and they're mostly all voluntary, unless they're adopted as a mandatory requirement by a authority having jurisdiction. But they use a multi-criteria approach, and they award points or credits for features like energy efficiency, water conservation, et cetera, to determine a building's overall sustainability. The most widely accepted and utilized green rating system is the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, developed by the U.S. Green Building Council and deployed globally. And LEED works, it's a holistic framework that addresses all of the issues we talked about and awards points with correspond to the levels of certain LEED certifications. You know, platinum being the highest, going down to certified. Teams adhere to the credits, achieve these points, and are awarded a pretty plaque at the end of the day. Now, full disclosure, the majority of our revenue is from LEED certified projects. These are typically marketplace visionaries that realize that they need some level of recognition for doing anything above that lowest first cost minimum code. So very quickly, we're going to talk about going deeper into this level of trust. So life cycle assessment has now become a prerequisite. It used to be a credit. You would get points for it. But with LEED version 5, that is now a mandatory requirement. If you don't complete this prerequisite, then you will not get a certification. And LEED, like other green rating systems, are drivers for initiatives that push the market, not too hard, but challenge the marketplace to deploy generationally responsible, mature, off-the-shelf solutions, be they designs, technologies, policies, or investment strategies. The objective is to measure and reduce embodied carbon, doing that with the low-hanging fruit, which in most buildings are the major structure, enclosure, and hardscape materials. The assessment approach is to use life cycle assessments or environmental product-based analysis. We're going to go through the whole building life cycle assessment here. I'm not going to spend too much time on how you achieve the credits, given that I've chewed up 10 minutes or 11 minutes just trying to get audio here. But the scope of the assessment right now is looking just at the cradle to grave. These are modules A to C, which Leo will get into more detail in his part of the presentation. You're awarded points, and we're speaking to primarily in North America and to some extent around the rest of the globe, the greenhouse warming potential. But it does address other parameters, which are listed here, from ozone depletion all the way down to depletion of non-renewable energy resources. There's different options to get there. And you can go above what's typically expected in the marketplace, and LEED and other green rating systems are recognizing that by just taking a look at the low-hanging fruit leaves a lot of opportunity on the table. So establishing the baseline model, I think this is where Leo takes over. Is that correct, Eileen?
Yes, actually, you can go forward one more slide.
All right. So to ensure a fair and consistent comparison between the baseline and proposed building designs, it's really important that we establish what the baseline is. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the P3I platform, but the baseline is super important. And with respect to how we interface with our clients, it needs to be marketplace representative. It needs to be constructible. It needs to be representative of what's happening in that locality. And it's probably the most difficult part to do on a life cycle assessment in justifying any type of initiative over and above that lowest first cost minimum code. So here we go, Leo.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So yeah, as mentioned, there's a lot of items that LEED addresses very well. And as David mentioned, is the low-hanging fruits. But the conversation that we're having today is not so much about obviously hitting those low-hanging fruits, which is obviously one thing that we need to do to achieve our low carbon objectives by 2030 as an intermediary step in 2050, but is also enabling that conversation to happen at a very practical level. And therefore, the going beyond the required LEED scope. And to do that, we're going to be dissecting it, starting from the building scope, which, as you know very well, because also you may be familiar with LEED, but also as already laid out by David, is not the full building. So first thing first, when it comes to the scope of assessment, it is to conduct a cradle-to-grave assessment from A to C that includes upfront carbon emissions, A stage, B stage emissions, which are the in use, and then C stages, which are the end of life. The expectation to include the structure, the enclosure, and the hardscape materials or landscaping materials. But because LEED does not require all materials within the site boundaries to be included, it automatically prioritizes the high impact elements of the building, which is all good and well, but it doesn't really move the needle when it comes to making a point to a board of investors, to your clients, when actually deploying these sort of initiatives. So to be perfectly clear, this is borrowed from a new rules of measurement taken from RICS, just for the benefit of understanding what we mean by substructure, envelope, and frames, so structural items, and external hard landscaping. We talk about those big hitters when it comes to carbon emissions, which is obviously very, very important to address. But by going beyond the building scope, we're essentially asking, or we're essentially taking on the journey, if you will, of including all materials within the site boundary. So that doesn't mean only the top hitters of materials, but including all of the mass, in fact, up to 90% of the mass of your building and surrounding areas within the red line boundary. This is not a number that I've plucked out of thin air. It's something that is recorded as to be best practice in the ISO and EN standards when it comes to product level assessment and building level assessment. As you can see, the exclusion can be justified by building function or weight below 5% of the total mass. And that's also the approach that we've taken when developing this broadened scope model with David. Simply put, by function, it means that if I don't have an outdoor swimming pool, I don't need to include it for the sake of having one. So that's basically what we're talking about. So that then led us to having assumptions being made with the use of Click LCA and in conjunction with P3I, obviously with David, to ensure not only that we would include this 90% of the mass according to the ISO and EN standard, but also that these inclusions would be representative of the market and constructions. More specifically, we addressed the finishes, FF&E, which is fitting, furnishing, and equipment, and MEP, and then internal walls and partitions. MEP is mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, essentially. So what we've done is, if you remember the slide we presented before, it was the red items, or the red boxes was the LEED scope. What we see is the inclusion of those additional elements to essentially comply with the expectation of representing the full building up to 95%. And as you can see there, it basically has expanded to all of the elements that we were talking about. Prefabricated buildings is not something that we necessarily applied. Facilitating works, it may not always apply for all of us, but the key driving principle here is to have that 90% inclusion. The way that this was done, again, was by utilizing the Carbon Designer 3D to represent whole building systems, and also constructions within Click LCA, which is a function that is specific to Click LCA, which allows you to represent and fill the gap where maybe knowledge lacks, given the design stage of your building, or maybe the fact that you may not simply have information. On top of that, we also have the luxury of having someone like David that could guide us through the refining of these assumptions to be more representative of the market. So simply put, it says live demo, but I'm not going to take too much time. I just want to show you actually, I need to share my screen first. So I just want to show you the extent to which the expansion of the scope went. So what we see right here is that the building baseline design. This is for a typical office building. We're going to go into more definitions on the assumptions, but this was the LEED scope. And what you can see there, if I scroll up from the top, a list of materials going from doors and windows, external wall and facade, floors, and so on and so forth, which is obviously what is expected from the LEED scope. But the thing that we then can also compare against, and this is only from a numerical point of view, or from even just a, if you will, qualitative point of view, just appreciate the difference in building materials. Because if I now scroll down, we not only have columns and different elements associated with the frame, but we also have the finishes, the internal load-bearing and non-load-bearing windows, and most importantly, in my opinion, but also in the as you can see in the results, the building systems. Now, we talked previously to Carbon Designer 3D. We do not have time to go into that, but I highly encourage you to check out Click LCA's website to understand what it is. But we talked about building constructions, which are essentially this long list of materials, which represents not only a more complex building part, but whole building systems. If anything, this is to speak to the powerful additions that you can make to your model. Now, on top of that, obviously, that has an impact on the way that our building essentially shows itself on the other side at the reveal stage. So again, let's take the perspective of starting from the LEED scope when it comes to lifecycle modules. Now, as already mentioned by David and quickly covered by myself, cradle to grave is the expectation for the analysis of the structure, enclosure, and hardscape materials. But it's important to appreciate that the reduced building scopes affects the completeness of the lifecycle modules being assessed due to the lack of data. Now, we can appreciate already that by reducing the number of materials, A1 to A5, aka the upfront carbon emissions, and C1 to C4, end of life, will have essentially a partial assessment due to the reduced building material scope. We don't include MEP, we don't include finishes, we don't include internal walls. So obviously the materials that go into my building are not going to be fully represented. So we already have partial elements being assessed within those lifecycle modules. But not only that, the loss that we have at the lifecycle module level by having a reduced building scope also affects the whole lifecycle modules, in more specifically the in-use. So we have something like B1, which is the in-use emissions, which are usually inclusive of refrigerant emissions. Because we don't include MEP, we not only lose part of B1, but we lose the whole of B1. So formally speaking, yes, we do have an A to C inclusion of emissions, but we actually lose the opportunity of seeing any meaningful outputs, in fact, all meaningful outputs from B1. Then we have B2, B3, and B4, which are namely maintenance, repair, and replacement. These are, again, excluded or heavily underestimated, as we have no finishes, no FF&E, and also no MEP being included. Now, if you think about what B2 to B3 represents, is the replacement of materials. We don't usually replace, well, we do sometimes replace the external envelope, but we definitely don't replace the structure of the building. What we do replace more frequently are the finishes, MEP, FF&E, all the elements that we're not including. So whilst LEED asks us to do an assessment inclusive of A, B, and C, which is what we see right here in the reported LEED scope, what actually LEED ends up having is a more of a fragmented representation of these different stages, and this is, in my opinion, the true representation of what the LEED scope is actually going to be inclusive of. So again, I just quickly want to show you the difference that we currently have by including the full scope by going into the results section. Again, of the baseline. So what we see right here, this is one Click LCA, by the way. You may or may not be familiar. If you're not, again, request the demo. But it's really visible. Again, I don't want to go into the details too much, but what we can all appreciate, and let me zoom in, is that we have certain numbers represented. We have a value in A stages. We have nothing in B1, B2, B3, some in B4 and B5, and then we have some C emissions. Now, let me flick back to the complete picture that we see right here, where we have a higher A1 to A4, A1 to A3, A4, and A5, but also B1, because we did include MEP, and as you'll see in a second, it is an electrified system for this building, so we had to represent refrigerants. But then we have a much more representative and a true profile of our B stages, as well as a true representation of our C stages. So again, if you allow me to flick back to the presentation here. So whilst we did have the expectation of representing certain elements according to LEED, we can see that there is an incredible loss of valuable information, valuable leverage that you might have and you might want to use when presenting your case. And that basically speaks to what was also highlighting David. So the implications from a building scope extension is the whole building perspective, a clearer link between embodied and operational carbon by including MEP. What are the impacts of my electrified system and the impacts of using a refrigerant-based solution versus not? Better whole life carbon management by the inclusion of in-use emissions, and also you speak to an audience that you wouldn't otherwise speak, the occupants. More opportunities for carbon reductions have been uncovered, and then a true representation of carbon improvements, which is exactly what David was talking about and what he, with his platform, is able to link with a more monetary and also people aspect of the conversation. So all of these things have been mentioned because hopefully what we're trying to do is to link the need of a whole life carbon assessment or the benefit of a whole life carbon assessment with the 3P, people, planet, profit conversation that David was outlining. And we're going to go into in the next section. Before I hand it over to David again, I think it's worth going into the results review. So we looked at everything from a bird's eye, if you will, so very qualitatively. But with the time that we have, I'm not going to take too much. I don't want to be eating away too much of our time. But what are the implications from having this sort of expansive approach to the scope? Well, so what we saw, what we actually do need to do before going into any more conversation is to highlight what the baseline specification of the US office was. As already mentioned by David, that US office was in fact aligned with market specifications. We did want to speak to an audience that was going to be engaged, and to do so we needed to represent things that they were probably working on a day-to-day. So what we represented is a concrete frame with US average Portland cement replacements between 0 to 20. Allow me for not going into more granularity, but obviously that depends on the C strength. Metal frame wall system with insulation, a multi-story concrete frame parking lot in the external area. And then that's related to the more LEED aspects. And then when it comes to the whole building lifecycle assessment, a fully electrified MEP system with an SOC pump and ventilation, a R410A refrigerants, and then office chairs and office desks. So as we went as simple as we possibly could, whilst maintaining the inherent function of an office, essentially allowing office workers to go in and carry out their work. So very quickly, from a baseline perspective, what do we see? Well, when looking at the building from a building baseline from a LEED V5 building elements, what we do see is that we have a very high impact coming from the floor slabs, ceiling, roofing, decks, beams, and floors. That should come as no surprise because those are the heavy hitters. And then the windows and doors, part of the external envelopes, and then some of the more vertical load-bearing structures, such as columns, because again, we're talking about a typical frame for a concrete building. Now, think about very, in your own time, what would the whole building life cycle assessment look like? Is it the same? Is it different? Am I seeing the exact same emissions, or does it change the frame completely? Well, what it does, it actually flips the script quite a bit, because we see two things happening at the same time. One, the inclusion of other elements in the top three, and two, a reduction of the overbearing impacts of certain reductions which are coming from LEED. Simply put, what we see is additional elements in the top three, aka the building system and installations, MEP, and the finishes and coverings. But not only that, we see also a reframing of the percentage of impacts for the materials that were already included, aka by having a full scope, the percentage of reductions expected from the building elements that include concrete and that are included in the LEED scope are not as seemingly important when it comes to the assessment. So basically it reframes everything in a more realistic way. So it adds value and it gives you true representation of the impacts. This is as much of a summary as I can get into. But the other thing that I also wanted to do is to give a comparative analysis of the difference between the two buildings. What we see on the screen on the left-hand side is the baseline design, and what you see is, a percentage of emissions. Two things that I would like to call your attention to. One is obviously the clear difference between the baseline design at LEED scope on the left-hand side and the baseline design of the full building scope on the right-hand side. Obviously quite significant, almost double. But then the other thing is the life cycle stages that are included within the assessment. Again, it speaks to that element of including the true emissions and including the true life cycle emissions of the building. What we see additional to the full building is the inclusion of your a much bigger B4 and B5, and we can speak to that by looking at the MEP elements, frequently replaced between 5 years and 15 years, but also the office chairs and office desk, frequently replaced between 5 and 10 years again. But then what we also see is the inclusion of our B1, which, mind you, being fairly small, but is still relevant, and it does play a big part, maybe not so much in the GWP, global wind potential, but because LEED assesses other indicators, it definitely does speak to those other indicators, and it will show up much more prevalently in those by analyzing those indicators. So a two kind of benefit, if you will, a double benefit. True representation and a more holistic representation, which speaks to an audience that is not solely focused on carbon reductions, but may also be focused on enabling those carbon reductions by also having a saving in money, essentially, which obviously, as you can imagine, moves the true needle when it comes to the site. Finally, I think this is my final slide. I apologize, David. This is the better design, which is the GGBS replacement in concrete, which is, again, what we see right here is the clear difference between the expectations or the reductions that we can see between one and the other one. So what we see right here is the performance of a 40% GGBS replacement in the better model. Just to give you an appreciation, this is the previous slide. You can see that it was just about the 7.5 million carbon of emissions. Visually represented, visually also you can see that. But the thing that we can also appreciate is the fact that that really doesn't move the needle as much as we would like in the full building part. And that is because we're assessing the overall carbon emissions, not just focusing on the high emitting elements. And then finally, this is the final part of the final kind of piece of the conversation. We started with a baseline design. We tested the carbon reductions according to LEED in the LEED scope, as well as the full scope. And then with David, we took it further even more, and we designed for a 10% MEP optimization. Essentially, if you were to improve your insulation and optimize for reduction of MEP materials, this is the building performance that you would have. And again, all of this information is very powerful on its own, and it can set you up for a meaningful conversation. It's even more powerful when it's joined with the rest of the work that we've done with P3I and with David, which is essentially joining the planet conversation, which we have at hand right now, expanded as we possibly could with people and profit. And I think with that, I will hand it over very briefly to Aileen, and then I think we're going on to David. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, David, for your earlier presentation. Before we get into the next part of the webinar, I'm going to put a quick poll up on the screen. If you'd like to learn more about either the LEED V5 tool or the Carbon Designer 3D tool that Leo referenced, you can click yes on the poll. That should be appearing on your screen right now. And we'll contact you to set up a demo where we can tell you more about these tools if you're a current customer, or if you are new to Click LCA, we'll be happy to help you out. And then if not, of course, you can just say no, and you can check out our website. And now we are going to learn, we're going to hand it back to David, and we're going to learn more about the P3I platform and how you can gain value from that. So David, I will hand it back over to you.
Fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes, I was muted, but yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Leo. So in the next 10 minutes, I guess, I want to make sure that we leave this presentation today with an understanding that the ability to dig deeper from a granularity perspective into the not just the materials, but also the means and methods of construction are equally important. And if we don't connect this deep dive level of trust with what is actually deployable in the marketplace, then we actually are never going to be transformative in creating real change. That's the reality. The marketplace will always win. And if we don't recognize that the investors are demanding higher levels of trust, and that all of these pressures are, requiring us to dig deeper and deeper all the time. Because in reality, LEED version 5 won't be the last version of LEED. I'll be around maybe for 6 or 7. I've been here since LEED 2009. The reality of it is that as the marketplace understands the value of doing these initiatives that bring greater asset value, not just to the investor, the owner of the asset, but also to the inhabitants of the asset and to the asset which is there. That's the important part. So right now, fortunately or unfortunately, transparency mechanisms like those available from Click LCA are out in front of the accountability side, right? Accountability, most people think accountability, they think of codes and mandatory requirements, but the marketplace is looking to create the best value. And marketplace visionaries have internalized that these sustainable assets are bringing them greater value over the long run. You may or may not have caught it, but the analysis for all of these life cycle assessments in LEED version 5 are 60 years. They're not looking at a 5-year return on investment. They're looking over the long term. So the value that we're able to create right now with these transparency mechanisms have to have an equal amount of accountability. And that's happening because the marketplace investors are realize that without this higher level of accountability, they're losing out on the opportunity. Simultaneously, there's a lot of developers and passionate individuals that want to create sustainable assets. And they want to show that these assets are sustainable. So they want the same tools to help them show investors that, hey, we're sustainable because we're using these tools to prove it. So the other important thing is the end game. And I think that most people don't realize what the end game is. The end game really is the complete democratization of the sustainability decision-making process. If you think about it with full transparency and full accountability, everybody, all stakeholders and shareholders will be able to see the impacts from an environmental, social, and financial perspective of every decision that we make. And once you realize that, then you realize why there's pushback from legacy decision makers because they feel that they're going to lose control. But in reality, the marketplace visionaries see this happening and they realize that they're actually creating assets that are worth more value. So they're not losing money. They're actually creating long-term value and they're getting out in front of this. This is not going to stop. That's the end game. So we're creating greater impact. So I'm going to go through these next few slides here relatively quickly. Investors are looking to maximize return on investment. Design and construction professionals, they want a completed project. They want their margins to be high. They know what to do and how to do it. What's missing in the marketplace is monetization of the why we do it. How do we deploy generationally responsible decisions and make them communicated in a dollar value perspective to do that and address this lowest cost minimum code paradigm. So P3I.Global uses all of the tools available to us, like the level of granularity that Click LCA, to develop these baseline models. These baseline models are constructible, marketplace representative, minimally code compliant, so that we can take those baselines. We can look at different designs, technologies, policies, and capital stack investments. And we can look at what the impact is going to be, prioritize them to how the client wants to look at this. Is it purely financial? Do they want to look more at the human side or the natural side? Break each one of those best practices out in a very specific manner so that we can communicate that to the investors and to the decision makers. This is what P3I.Global does. In the process of developing the capability to do that, we've created the Planet People Profit Impact, the P3I Platform. And the purpose of that, P3I.Global is a firm that is dedicated to advocating for the accelerated deployment of these generationally responsible best practices. We want to create awareness, internalization, and more importantly, pathways to action. This is a busy slide, but if you start at the top, creating awareness by illuminating these best practices using tools like Click LCA, the life to address the lowest first cost minimum code models. That's what Leo spent time on. And then creating the data visualizations, and more importantly, connecting all of that to the practitioners that actually deploy this information. The P3I platform is not another rating system. We don't need another rating system. We need a communications portal, an opportunity awareness tool that shows what the value is, not just to the investor, but also to the inhabitants and to the community at large. This is a simple output of some of the results that we have when you start looking at this information. We can break down what the natural benefit is compared to 0 on the left-hand side. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is the lowest first cost minimum code. These are the baselines that we've made with one click. We can look at what the human impact is, and we can get away from just looking only at what the financial impact is. So I'll wrap it up there. That was a lot to throw at you in the last few minutes. But again, without these tools, we wouldn't create the level of trust that is needed by investors and by developers equally to put money into designs, technologies, policies, and investment strategies that create the best value. A call to action. Our platform is currently free. We want best practice champions and marketplace visionaries to join us as we refine our monetization methodologies and our models. So if you're interested in being part of this initiative, I ask that you reach out to us.
Thank you so much, David. And I just put up another poll asking you guys if you want to learn more about the P3I platform. And if so, we will put you in touch with David and he can share more about that. You didn't mention it specifically, but when on the slide where you were talking about how we don't need another green rating system, you did have a note that money, it's the sort of the ultimate green rating system, which I thought was great. So thank you guys both so much for your presentations, so much information. Thank you to our audience for the great questions and for working with us through a few technical issues. Brandy, quick answer to your question. Yes, you will get a recording of this session immediately after it ends. It's going to go straight to your email. And I just wanted to let everyone know my dog did bust into my office about halfway through the webinar. Luckily, I was on mute because chaos ensued. There's a little chaos in here. So, but you know, it's not a webinar without a few without a few hitches. So I hope you guys all got a lot out of this webinar. Thanks again so much for joining us. Thank you, David, as always, for lending your expertise to our webinars. Thank you, Leo, for joining us. And we will see you guys on the next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.